And good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas, and I'm the Vice President of the SSA New South Wales branch. Our President Carl, unfortunately, is a bit unwell today, so she can't join us in person. And we wish her to get better very soon, so she can take back her usual spot and hosting this event. And on behalf of the branch, thank you everyone for joining us this branch meeting, and hope everyone is still staying safe while enjoying the new COVID normal. We'll begin the formal part of the evening with acknowledgement of the country. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gallingal people, the traditional guardian of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Dr. Michael Brewery of Nearmap. Michael has degrees in electrical engineering and physics, and also a massive passion for machine learning. And he joined Nearmap about 5 years ago as their first data scientist. Now is a senior director of AI systems. He offers extensive machine learning experience from Cognia, Combank, and the Australian Centre for Field Robotics. And Michael leads the development of technology behind Nearmap AI, quantifying the evolutions of cities with the rich, accurate AI dataset. And tonight, Michael will talk a little bit about how to bring AI into action. Right? Please join me and welcome Michael, and I'd like to take away.
All right, let's get started. Thanks for having me, everyone. Pleasure to join you. This is going to be an interesting talk because I've talked about this material in a few different forums, but not just statisticians. I've talked to people who are interested in trees. I've talked to people in the geospatial community. But I think you guys will have some really interesting questions, particularly in the later parts where I talk about the analysis I did, because this opens up sort of some really interesting new possibilities for analysis. And I think there's a lot of clever stats that would go on with how you make use of this data. So I'll be very curious to hear your thoughts at the end. And I will mercilessly drag out the awkward silences until I get some questions. So we'll see how we go. All right, let's start by giving you a clicker that doesn't work. Oh, come on. There we go. I'll give you a little bit of background about who I am, and then I'll give a bit of background on who the company is, and then I'll talk about some interesting statistical analysis. So as mentioned, I've done a few different things in my past. I'm definitely not a statistician, but I've worked a lot with data. This was in undergrad, doing 3D brain scans using principal component analysis to try and tell the difference between Alzheimer's and normal brains. It actually worked really well. These are just the first 3 principal components for you guys talk about that in StatsLand. I worked at Cochlear and did systems design, but also a lot of product data analysis, so trying to understand how people were using our products, as well as looking at audio signals, and there's lots of really, really interesting audio data work there. Worked at ACFR with the Marine Robotics Group. Basically, this was one of the robots that you throw off a boat. You have to program it to go around on the sea floor. It'll collect imagery from the sea floor. Marine scientists would then tag those photos with what species of coral or whatever it was. And my job was to try and interpret automatically what was in the images, so they didn't have to spend months and months tagging images. I had a little bit of time at Combank. I don't have a slide for that, but then I joined Nearmap. So who is Nearmap? Do people know who knows a little bit about Nearmap or never heard of it? Good. Okay, well, let's give you some background. So Nearmap is an Aussie tech company, headquartered here with R&D and central operations here, but we operate in 4 countries: Australia, US, New Zealand, and Canada. We do location intelligence now. We started as an aerial imagery company maybe about 12 years ago. And that really started with our very own camera systems that were designed and built here, popped into planes, and then you're flying kind of 10, 20,000 feet in the air, trying to get clear shots of the ground with a really, really long zoom lens. And it's really, really hard to do efficiently. Yes. 20,000 feet. 10 or 20,000 feet in height.
What is that in meters?
I don't know. We could Google it. But I'm not going to do basic maths on a stage because that leads to disaster. It's like writing code in an interview or something. So they're little Cessna planes that fly around and capture imagery about the world. Have we got an answer? 6,000 meters. Okay, there we go. Give or take. So we've got this imagery program, and typically what aerial imagery providers would do was they'd fly a special survey that someone would pay for in advance and then get shipped the data on hard disks later on. What we started was a subscription model where we're flying Australian capital cities up to 6 times a year. And in the US, we fly kind of 1 to 3 times a year. We cover 90% of Australia's population and I think something like 80% of the US population. Obviously, that's not by landmass. We focus on urban areas because that's where we can efficiently capture. That's what our customers are interested in. It's all business to business with a lot of customers in the government, insurance, and similar spaces. We fly planes. So just denotes a few different things. Satellites are higher up. They have global coverage, but they have much lower resolution, and it's difficult to get nice, clean repeat captures because of clouds and things like that. So there are different challenges up there. Drones and things are great, but a drone can fly around a building site or something, or a small area and take a great survey. But we can cover, you know, a whole capital city in Australia in a matter of hours in a plane. So we're really at the sweet spot for really high resolution. So it's 5 to 7 centimeters per pixel. So you can see things like whether a roof is made of tiles or ColourBond or something like that. We're at that sweet spot for really monitoring what's happening in cities over time. We don't just do aerial imagery, we have all sorts of software layers wrapped around applications, APIs, and AI content. So when I joined Nearmap, it was just an aerial imagery company, and you can see on the left of that image, the AI overlay, as we call it, the AI layers. Basically, we use deep learning to extract a whole bunch of different semantic layers about the world and build this vector map of what's in the world. Things like building outlines, where the trees are, and we've got dozens and dozens of different layers that get produced automatically. And then we can start to use that data in really interesting ways because we have maps of whole cities like this that are updated on a regular basis. Here's just some examples of our content. We do top-down capture. We capture from the side as well. We create 3D models out of the imagery. So you kind of look at, it's a technique called structure from motion, where you're looking at multiple images from different angles, and you can build 3D models of whole cities. And we do that at a larger scale than most people. Sydney, you know, on the whole, gets an update every year or so of a fresh 3D model. And we've got a whole range of other products as well. This is a little teaser video that we made about 3 years ago for where our AI technology was at then. This is when we launched our first beta product, and it gives just a nice little overview of what we do. So that was a 3-year-old tech. We're now at our 4th generation of AI systems. So for those of you who are into software development, this is kind of, we have a Semver style versioning system for our data. That's kind of the fourth round of our deep learning models, and there's a versioning system on top of that. This is an example of what the data looks like. It's all fully automatically generated. There's no hand touch-ups on the output, which means you can push out, you know, thousands of square kilometers of this stuff at really high speed. We have interesting conversations with AWS about things like availability of GPUs to be able to do that. We work on clusters of thousands of machines. Our imagery data sets are, I can't remember how many tens of petabytes. I think we're north of maybe 40 petabytes now, and we've produced petabytes of output like this. This is a nice little example of construction in that there's a distinction that you can draw between mapping and monitoring. So mapping is the idea that you've got a recent map of what's in the world. Monitoring is the idea of looking at how that map evolves over time. And because we're capturing in, you know, multiple times a year, you can actually think about not just saying what has changed from one date to the next, but what is changing right now and not yet finished. This is a view of the things that we have in our fourth generation product. Interestingly, we have one deep learning model that drives all of this, and then there's a whole bunch of different post-processing algorithms that happen on the back of it. So what I'm going to talk about now is what you can do with that data. Because once you've built that system that is continuously generating every single week, it's churning through more and more data as we update our view of the world. What do you actually do with that data? Now we've got lots of customers doing fascinating things, but it's much easier to talk about something we've done because we can talk about it in its entirety. So the first bit I'll talk about is our national tree canopy study. And there's more information if you want to go online. There's a few blog posts up, but I'll talk through it here. So this is our tree and building outline data in one particular suburb in Sydney. And this is in a different suburb. Very, very different composition in terms of tree and building, not just in the proportion, but in the way they're distributed. In the previous one, the trees were off on one side and there were actually no trees in amongst the buildings at all. If you put them side by side, you can see that there's very, very different behavior if you take the imagery away. We can then think about doing that kind of analysis, but on 5,000 suburbs across Australia at a recent time point. This was early 2021. So if you take our imagery as a base layer, this is just an example in part of Sydney. I trust many of you are familiar with mesh blocks. For those who aren't, these are an Australian Bureau of Statistics unit of basically a group of houses, or rather sort of similar sized chunk of land. So all of Australia is divided up into mesh blocks and they have different types. So we can calculate the average tree cover just by percentage area in all of these different mesh blocks. And now for this analysis, we chose to throw away the non-residential mesh blocks. And that's because we were interested in things like urban heat islands. And for that, what you really care about is not the trees in national parks nearby, but it's the trees in and amongst the houses, in backyards, in front yards, on streetscapes and so on. So we can look at just the residential mesh blocks, and then we can look at each suburb. And suburbs are a good unit because they're a unit that someone can relate to. No one knows what mesh block they live in, or maybe people in this room do, but most people don't know what mesh block they live in, but they will know the name of the suburb. So you can start to talk about analysis on a suburb level. So what we did here was we took the average tree cover of all residential mesh blocks within each suburb and created a residential tree canopy cover score per suburb. And you can see some other numbers there that give the total tree canopy cover, which also includes the non-residential, and you can do it with buildings. And to be honest, you can do it with any of dozens of categories we have. But this was almost about seeing what power we can get out of just one or two of our many attributes. This is what happens if you zoom out and look at that. These are coloured by percent residential tree cover and coloured as a whole suburb. These are some of the cities we did. So we've got all capital cities and a whole bunch of major towns as well that comprise about 5,000 suburbs in this analysis. And you can then do some really cool stuff. So this is what happens if you use more ABS data and say, let's look at greater capital cities as compared to their regional areas and look at the percent tree cover. So each dot there is an individual suburb, and it's just showing the residential tree cover. And no one's been able to do this before because most measures of tree cover are done either at a low resolution, so you can look at it, for example, at an LGA level, that involves a lot of handwork, or they're done in a particular city by, there might be one survey commissioned by a particular company. They might make a great data set at one point in time, but in order to make valid statistical comparisons, you need to have identical methodology. So this is done with this. We've got a very, very consistent imagery capture program. And this was run with the identical version of our AI system across the top of it. So it's the same model, which means you can actually make comparisons. This one is going to be fascinating to some of you. If you mash it up with the 2016 census data, which is the latest data that was available, you can see, again, each dot is a suburb. The size of the suburb is proportional. So the area of the suburb is proportional to the population in 2016. You're mapping the percent tree cover against the percent building cover. I think this was total rather than residential. And then you can color it by the greater capital city. And you can see along that top edge, you see all the Sydney blobs where there's a really high residential tree cover. Even as you go out towards higher building density, you can still maintain pretty high tree cover. And if you look in, if I can get my clicker thingy to work, around here, you've got some really interesting suburbs that have an exceptionally high both tree cover and population density, places like Annandale, where you've got rows of densely packed houses, but there's lots and lots of trees around as well. And you contrast that to some of the suburbs down here in your bottom left, which have large populations, but the building density is not actually that high, and they still don't have many trees. And what you see there is there's a lot of these newer suburbs where buildings are much quicker to build than trees are to grow. So trees can take 10, 20 years to reach a reasonable level of maturity, but these suburbs can go up very, very quickly. So it's really, really important to, if you're looking at things like urban cooling and heating effects, trees can have many degrees of impact on that. In some situations, it can be up to 10 degrees of surface temperatures. And so managing how we're building and where we're putting the trees is a critically important problem. And again, this is, there was no possible way to produce this graph before we had data like this. And this is, once you have that data, it's actually a pretty straightforward graph to produce. I'll work at my clicker again. Okay, maybe I'll have to go spacebar. No, we're not cooperating. There we go. This is similar data to before. In the bottom left, we asked the question, where are people living? So what percentage of the population in that greater capital city are living in a very leafy suburb? So we defined a very leafy suburb as one with 20% or more residential tree cover. And that's kind of a goodish amount of tree cover if you look at the studies. And then you can see that in Brisbane, for example, 79% of the population is living in a suburb that has at least that much residential tree cover. And you see a lot of variation because there's different background environments. Some places have drier climates, some places have wetter climates. So it's not really about who's the best, but it's about just having a comparison and understanding the differences. Because even if you have a reasonable reason that you have lower tree cover, like you have a drier climate, when you have those really, really hot summer days, the trees make a huge difference. So you want to be aware of that. On the right, you can see there's just sort of a heat map, which you probably can't quite read, of things like suburb total tree cover against total building cover, and then just bucketing what percentage of the population lives in each one. So that you're statisticians, so you'll see how the stuff in the bottom left was derived from the stuff on the right. And again, this isn't fancy stats. You'd even probably struggle to call it stats. It's just basic, calculating some basic numbers off data and seeing what wasn't possible to see before. So what do we do next? That was when you take a consistent system and run it to compare multiple cities. And because we actually run the same system in all 4 countries, we could do that analysis in 4 countries, which would be fascinating to do, but would take a little longer. The other thing we can do is we can go back in time. In Australia, we have an archive of something like 12 years of imagery. And because we have a fully automated system, all we have to do is say, well, let's go and run those surveys with our latest AI system, and you can get retrospective data on what the tree cover was like back then. As long as we have imagery captured, we can run it. So we thought, what happens if we take one city, one that's not too large, so we can process a decent amount of data quite quickly. So we picked Adelaide, and we said, what's happened over the last 10 years? My clicker really doesn't like me. So this is data that we went out with. We had 281 suburbs that we covered on at least 2011 and 2021 across that decade. And we were interested again in residential tree cover, same type of analysis as the national study. And then we said, well, what happened? So we looked at the relative change in tree cover. So for example, if you had 20% residential tree cover and you went to 22%, that's a 10% relative increase, which again is an important distinction, but that's actually what matters. If you have low tree cover, any amount of increase is actually really, really powerful. So relative percentage is the right one to pick. Across the board, you can see the pink suburbs are the ones that dropped tree cover in that decade, and the green ones are the ones that gained. And the median suburb lost 9.8% residential tree cover over that period of time. And again, there was no possible way to do that analysis without this data. This is what happens when you look at the mesh block level. You see some really fascinating patterns. You see, you can see areas where there's a clump of high loss, there's a clump of high gain, and then there's sort of ones that are all interspersed, and you realize that there are just so many different stories going on in here that you know, there's all sorts of different micro areas of different plans were made by local councils or people kind of trended towards a certain thing in a certain area. And there's all sorts of fascinating insights you could pull out. Because I'm not an Adelaide expert, to make it sane, we looked at individual suburbs and we just graphed it. So this wasn't a start to finish to date analysis. This was seasonally matched data. We looked at all the captures we had in the January to March region for the years between 2011 and 2021. Averaged them if there were multiple, often we had 2 captures, so you average the result to get a less noisy signal. And then you just track it over time. And so here you can see not only the change, but you can see the trend and how it changes. If it suddenly rockets up and then flattens out, that means something. And if it goes up steadily or down steadily, that means something else. So these are just some of the suburbs, but you can build this graph easily for any one of the 281 suburbs that were in the coverage area. This is a little video of one suburb, Northgate, which was a fairly new suburb at the time. It was established, but fairly new. You can see trees growing over time. So these little saplings just grow year on year. And the graph in the top right is showing that steady growth. You'll also see some solar panels come on top of the buildings that I put there just for a bit of fun. And you can see the number of buildings is growing slightly. So the built area is growing a little bit, but the trees are growing at that same point in time. And so you can see the before and the after of that decade of growth. So there's actually some of these newer suburbs get a bad rap for having low tree cover, which is understandable. But some of them are really, really working hard to make those trees grow and look after them. And that's what really matters, rather than how many trees you have, but are they growing into mature canopy? The next one is Vale Park. This one is a story of gentrification. Very mature suburb. You'll see the pink splotches are construction sites, and they come in and basically you can see one house and then a pink splotch, and that will often turn into 2 houses. This is called urban infill development, where a block gets split and they tend to build a higher density of buildings in that area, and you can see the buildings go up over time. This is the before and that's the after. And you can see basically it's not been one particular point in time, it's just been steady increase of that infill development in that suburb and steady decline in the mature tree canopy, which drops the overall cover. The last one I'll show you is a more dramatic one in St Clair. This is a very, very specific kind of local area plan that was made. They decided to turn an old racecourse into a suburb. You have an initial drop in tree cover because they basically raise the trees to the ground, but then they start growing them. You see the buildings rocket up in the early stages, and then it slows down, but it's still going up. So you can see the trend is still upwards. So they obviously got their initial build in, but they're still going with a few more things to this day. And they put in a nice wetland there as well. And so this is an example of a suburb that was very deliberately planned, and they tried to make sure that they had a nice green environment. The next thing I want to talk about is managing methodologies, and this is probably interesting for you for a different reason to other audiences. Other audiences I've talked to this about are more familiar with other ways of measuring tree canopy, and LiDAR is one such example, which is basically you have a laser in a plane and you're bouncing light off and looking at backscatter and trying to determine trees that way, and it's kind of the gold standard. And there are also human assessment methods called iTree, where you're basically looking physically at a tree, either in an image or walking up to it and taking a random subset of points within a local government area, for example. So how do we measure up against the gold standard? On the left, we have the Nearmap AI trees. On the right, you have the LiDAR data, which has been, typically they basically have, they have long-standing heuristic algorithms to work out what the trees are and what the buildings are from LiDAR data. It's not using deep learning. And then in this case, they bucketed it to a 1 square meter grid. And you can see that on the one hand, the trees are certainly, it's capturing essentially the same thing, but there's some differences. There's different quirks and different artifacts. And at a visual level, it's hard to tell what impact that difference will have. And you can see here an area with higher trees. Again, it's very similar. You'd expect a similar result, but there are differences. Sometimes one picks a result that the other one doesn't, and vice versa. And the LiDAR has some artifacts that the Nearmap AI data doesn't. So the comparison slide. There was one LiDAR survey available from 2018, and we were able to choose our match date because we can pick any date we like, basically, and compare to the LiDAR data. And they had LGA level summaries. So what percent cover each LGA had. So I recalculated with the non-residential mesh blocks in. So we had a kind of as similar methodology as possible. And on the left in the blue dots, what you'll see, that cluster of blue dots is the relative difference for each LGA. So each dot is an LGA between the LiDAR data and the Nearmap data. And you see two very interesting things. One is they're very highly correlated. Those, if you look at which suburb, which LGA was higher and which was lower, very, very consistent pattern, which is why those are clustered together. But there's like a 19% offset. So you can ask yourself, what's going on there? That seems important, particularly when people are very carefully looking at policy around, we need to get to X% tree cover. Well, what methodology are you using? So there's an offset, but there's a high degree of consistency between what's known as the existing gold standard. On the right, you can see the only other national tree study data that's been done was done with 1,000 random points per LGA using this iTree analysis approach. You can see it's got a similar sort of mean for the data, so it doesn't have that systematic offset, which is great because I would hope that the human expert analysis is the one that's going to have the least bias on their measurement, because they'll know what a tree is when they look at it, whereas these automated approaches might have a bias. So it looks like we don't have a systematic bias. Then you look at that spread, and at first you think, well, that's a large spread. What's all the randomness for? If you work out I'm talking to statisticians, so I've got to be correct here. If you work out the margin of error that you expect to get with 1,000 random samples per LGA, you kind of take it like a poll where you've got a binary result, is it tree or not? And you've got 1,000 random points. You blissfully ignore spatial correlations and that kind of thing. You basically get bang on that spread. So if you go with the assumption that the Nearmap data is correct, which is of course my assumption, then there's no statistical, there's no systematic shift, and the variance is totally explained by basic stats. And that was really, really exciting for me because we're a new methodology on the block and people are kind of obviously questioning it and saying, well, is this as good as the old methodologies? Now let's get back to that 19% offset. What's going on there? Because that seems important. Now, if you look at that blue circle in the bottom left, again, as numerical people, you're probably not as fooled by this, but if you add the orange ring around it, you've actually added 19% total area. And that's not obvious when you kind of size it up with your eyes. You're like, really? And you're probably sitting there going, really, is that 90%? And I checked it a few times and it is. So my hypothesis is that a slightly different treatment around the edges of the trees can very easily result in systematic 19% offset. And if you go back, and I'll just click back a couple of slides now so you can see it. Remember, the standard approach there was to bucket to 1 square meter grid, and you can see maybe they're just a little more generous than us on the edges. The imagery behind the LiDAR is not the correct imagery. I couldn't delete that off the base map. So it's the imagery from the left is the correct date. But if you look at, they're just a bit more generous around the edges of the trees, and that can result in that massive systematic offset, which is something to be aware of. So obviously, again, to this audience, if you want to make comparisons over time, you must use a consistent methodology. Otherwise, you're going to be confounded by all this crazy stuff. And there is very little you can do to be as consistent as taking a whole lot of imagery that's captured in the same way, running it with exactly the same set of software on top of it, which is a model plus a whole lot of post-processing algorithms. And you compare that to something like LiDAR, where there's often maybe a 3-year gap in the cycle, and you don't quite know exactly what post-processing they're doing and who's doing the post-processing. So that's the comparison there. Now, one thing LiDAR can do that people ask about is 3D. So you can get basically 3D point cloud from LiDAR. I didn't look at 3D at all with this analysis. This is really just a little proof of concept that was done a while ago that shows we can basically take our 3D mesh that we build from our imagery. We can build a digital terrain model, which is when you scrape off the buildings and the trees, and the digital surface model, which is just a kind of a vertical drop down on our mesh. And you can work out things like tree heights and do contours of height. And you can look at the 3D structure of the trees. So we can do 3D stuff as well. It's not quite the same as LiDAR, because with LiDAR, you can kind of penetrate through the foliage and see where the trunk is. But if you want to look at things like biomass and tree height, these things are possible as well. Okay, for time, yeah. And one last, I guess, point of reference, this is just against some US data. Something I came across was this idea of the wildland urban interface, which gets used a lot in the insurance space when they're talking about fire risk. And they're essentially doing this sort of analysis, but they're doing it with census data. So their equivalent of mesh blocks are called census blocks. They're sort of equivalent. Their censuses are every 10 years. So they update this data set every 10 years. They get the building density as just basically from the census results. They're not calculating it from the imagery. And they're getting tree data from various sources like satellite analysis, which can do a reasonable job of trees. So you then get this sort of rating for each effectively mesh block. And you can then think about you know, what fire risks are presented there. And if you overlay that, this is an area in the US, you've got areas which are supposedly uninhabited or low density, or, you know, the colors kind of roughly indicate that there's some different fire risks. And that's kind of that was the state of the art. People are starting to use things like, there's some free building data sets out there, but statistically, you get much more interesting things if you, so these are the Nearmap AI buildings overlaid over the top and the Nearmap AI trees. There's just so much more richness and subtlety in that map that you can pull out. You can see in that middle bit, you've got really, really dense tree cover. And then in the other orange bits, you've got some areas which are actually really scattered and sparse. So probably in in that bottom center, that's probably lower fire risk there, because there's quite a lot of space between the houses and the trees. So the richness of picture you can get here is just astounding compared to what's there today. And the fact that you can track it over time and do it regularly is, I think, pretty compelling. I'm going to finish up there. And I'm going to hold for that awkward silence of statistical questions on my analysis, because I'm really, really curious to see what you think.
Okay, so thanks very much, Michael, for a wonderful talk. Do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, Gordana.
Thank you, Michael. Great talk. Yeah, I'm just very interested in so the comparison to the LiDAR, is it?
Yep.
I've done a tiny bit of machine learning, so forgive me for being like completely a novice. But sometimes when like people have been doing things like using non-machine learning methods to classify things, and then people switch to machine learning methods and they do better because they're just better at that. But then sometimes you can learn from the old methods, like some tricks to sort of input into the new methods that actually improve it. And like, do you do that kind of, like, is there tricks and bits and things that they do that kind of that improve the models that you have in the machine learning world?
Generally, I'd say that's a sound concept. I'd say in this case, because the LiDAR data is fundamentally different in its nature. So our deep learning models are working off imagery, and we only capture imagery. LiDAR is sending a signal and getting a pulse back and kind of measuring the flight time, and you end up with a 3D point cloud. So the algorithms they use on top of that are very, very different from what we would use. There's different strengths and weaknesses. So if there's imagery where it's really hard to pick the trees, you can get situations where the trees don't get picked up as well. But LiDAR, for example, doesn't work so well on steep slopes because of the way it does the classification. It gets confused. So yeah, in general, I would say that applies, but not here because the source data is so different. If the source data was the same, then yes, absolutely. The other difference is LiDAR is a lot more expensive to capture, which is why we don't have it. You get people excited about that we did one capture of one small city, and then maybe we'll do it again in 3 years' time, which is very different to us just churning through the imagery like clockwork. So yeah, good question.
Thank you. Great talk. Could you share just maybe a little bit about what is actually in the AI? Is it like a neural network model such that it does all that segmentations and object identification kind of things? Or
yeah. No, I can talk a little about it. Sure. Where should I start? So it's at the core, it's a deep learning model. Sure. And we produce what's called a raster layer from that, which is pixels. So each RGB pixel becomes a semantic pixel, and then you've got all these different layers. So it's like you've got we've got something like a 50-channel image basically that comes out, where one layer, each pixel represents the probability that we believe that pixel is a tree. And at the very end of the deep learning model, there's actually a little logic where it's going, is this tree or not? And then there's all these layers that go back, and we've got a custom deep learning architecture that learns from imagery and runs that final prediction. And each one of those layers is independent. So we call it, in machine learning, we call that multi-label, where you are allowed to have the probability of it being tree doesn't change the probability of it being building. And that's in fact how we do tree overhang. So we train, I'll talk about label data in a moment, but we train on a data set where the labels attempt to predict out under the trees. So the buildings will you will estimate where the edge of the building is under the tree, simply because that's where the human expert label has been. And so you can have a building layer, and then you have a tree layer which overlaps with that, and you just take the spatial intersection, and you've got the tree overhang, which is relevant for a whole bunch of different scenarios.
I see.
Yeah, and then I guess a lot of it is around label data, which I didn't talk about at all. So we have our own labeling tool. It's built on our on our map browser software. We label, I think we're north of 1 million labeled images now, with lots of really fine detailed labeling. And a huge part of the reason this works is you just have a very, very large number of human experts just labeling away. And then this is really just about learning that pattern and scaling it up.
Okay.
Let's check whether there's any questions for the online audience. For any online audience, if you have any questions, feel free to type that into the chat, or you can unmute yourself. Lynn, you are trying to ask a question? So. No one has any questions at the moment, I think.
Lynn, unmute.
Oh, yes, maybe.
Yeah. Hi.
Hang, you've got one. We've got one.
Hi, I'm Joe. Yeah, I have questions. That is, So how is it related to the building cover, tree cover, any insurance covers related to how you can calculate the tree's growth and how it is related to that? So any kind of key factors that you may think is related to some insurance product?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Maybe I can talk a little bit about who the customers of this data are, because I basically did some, once you've done all the number crunching, it's some fairly sort of straightforward analysis on top of this data. Where this data gets used is in local government space. They're looking at things like how their area is changing over time. They have kind of a duty of care of making sure their suburban area is a livable area. So they often, we have local governments kind of signing up both for the imagery and for the AI data. We have insurers using it, and they're looking at things like you know, pre-filling forms where you go on the website and they want to ask you 200 questions about, I don't know, do you know how many square meters your building is? So they try and pre-fill some of that, whether you have solar panels, a pool, all that kind of thing. And also they're starting to bake it into risk models as well. And they're kind of calculating their own results off this. So for example, in the US, a big thing is things like roof condition, which is one of the groups of attributes we have. So the roofs over there are really designed to last 5 to 15 years, depending on the material. So you can have some roofs in very variable state that has a very big impact on insurance. So insurers tend to use this at a single property level, and local governments tend to use it on at an LGA level, and then you've got a whole lot of other sorts of organizations using it as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Another question. Is that comparing with the LiDAR, that is data, I can see that is your estimation is a bit more smoother, right? So you can see that it edge more smoother. So is that more advantages when you can evaluate the loss or something, the insurance, is it?
Yeah, so I guess insurers don't really use LiDAR because it's too expensive to capture at scale, and they need to cover their whole book of business. So LiDAR is more a government thing where they'll pay some large sum of money to get their city surveyed. The smoothness comes from the deep learning model that we have produces output at the same resolution as the input. So you've got 5 to 7 centimeters per pixel, and then you just you do a vectorization algorithm that and put a little bit of smoothing on it, and it looks like what I showed you. The LiDAR is, they kind of measure it as points per square meter. So they might measure it as, I don't know, 100 points per square meter or whatever. And then they've got to somehow average and wrangle that. And it works out that their points per square meter is like much lower density than our effective points per square meter when you look at the number of pixels we produce. And that's why ours is smoother. Also, I think the context of the deep learning models is quite large. So our models take in, I think, I kind of remember the exact context. It might be 100 meters or something by 100 meters. So imagine that kind of window, and nearby pixels are biased to be similar to each other. So kind of the model can learn from all that. Whereas the heuristic algorithms with LiDAR have, I guess, other more maybe mechanistic algorithms which don't necessarily enforce that sort of local similarity, which is why you can have a nice tree and then there's just a single dot missing in the middle, maybe because there was some weird artifact with that dot. I don't know a huge amount about LiDAR processing, but that's roughly why there would be that difference.
Okay, thank you.
All right. We'll take a question from the audience.
Thanks, Mike. The images you showed of sort of the before and after of tree cover in certain locations seemed, just on a very quick glance, the changes seem very subtle. So from between one time to another, to the human eyeball, I mean, so, you're looking at it and you say, this is the before and that's the after, and you go, there's been a big change in tree cover. It might not necessarily be too obvious for the human eyeball. This might be more of like a business sort of focused question, but when you are able to run these models, are customers or people that are viewing it surprised by the amount of tree cover that's being gained or lost relative to what they're seeing with their eyeballs?
Yeah, it's just really hard to do with your eyes, isn't it?
Yeah.
You kind of look at it and you glance at it and you get an idea. And that's an example. I think when you see the before and after with just the trees, it's hopefully pretty clear. With Northgate as an example, if I kind of rewind that slightly for you. So there's before and there's after. Like that's a pretty stark difference. And that's a nice one. That's growth. You can see all these tiny dots turn into bigger dots because they were saplings. But yeah, we see people have all sorts of surprises when they look at our data because it's a new source of data with a different perspective. Aside from this, we work with a lot of organizations that already have, like they might have theoretically the information on where the solar panels are, but then they kind of wash it against our data and look for the differences, and they find surprising errors in their own data because our data does have, our errors relate to things like occlusion, like whether there's something hiding it physically, whereas for solar panel data, the error is totally uncorrelated. It might be whether I don't know, whether someone's filling out their forms correctly, that there is a solar panel or something else. So you get, when you put two data sets together with uncorrelated errors, you can get a really, really nice total data set. But yeah, it just gives you a different view on the world. We've got this, you can actually view this in our map browser product now. So if you get the AI data, you can kind of click and get this as a heads up display. And I just sit there for hours looking at stuff. You zoom out a bit and you kind of and you kind of look at it's QA. It's all QA. You kind of look at before and after, and even if you just put on a single layer and you can kind of do a pane to swipe across before and after, just visually, you see so many more differences than you would with the imagery, because it's basically stripping away the stuff that is irrelevant, stripping away the noise, and saying, green equals tree, and then like, oh, I suddenly saw an extra bit there. So you can pick up all sorts of things. That's not the core of our product. I think there's just most of the people who are paying for the AI data are using it as data, kind of in a programmatic sense. Like we've got APIs to deliver it, or we can deliver big offline files. But I think there's just a fascinating space of kind of human-machine interaction when you're trying to visually explore an area. And you're using this as a bit of a heads-up display to help you do that. Yeah. Another one?
Yeah, one last question. So are you saying this sort of data is currently being used for like insurance companies trying to evaluate like fire risk for homes and things like that already, or are they still at the sort of the suburb, LGA, whatever level?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the insurer. I think the US insurers are probably ahead of the Australian ones in that regard. I guess they're taking their models from larger and larger scale and bringing it more down to a single property type level. Yeah. So certainly very much in the US, they're actively using property level characteristics to estimate risks. Obviously, they have to do it very carefully, and there's some usage of that in Australia as well. But I think it's more advanced over there.
Great.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Any more online?
Yep,
I see someone with the green box
someone
still.
typed in the chat.
Oh, yeah. Can I?
We can click on
I'll
the chat to see, or just
kill this. Oh no, there's the chat. Oh, it's doing the thing again. Let me kill screen share.
just say thank you, maybe.
Let's find out if it's actually a question. Thank you. Okay, great.
Okay. Right. So any last minute questions from the online audience? Someone joined.
I think we had a late joiner. You missed a bit. You might want to.
He just wanted to join in and ask a question. All right, maybe we shouldn't wait.
It still says connecting to audio. That's all right.
Hi, Justin. Anyway, all right. So in that case, if there's no further questions, I'll just say wrap up this meeting. Thank you everyone that joined us in person and also online this evening. I can say for certain I had a wonderful time listening to Michael talk about how AI are actually used to analyze the data. I hope so you had a wonderful time too. And for last time, please join me and thank Michael for a fantastic talk.
Oh, thanks for having me. And thanks for the interesting questions.
Okay.